The scream pierced the darkness like a knife. Alexander Reed jolted awake, gasping for air, his heart hammering against his ribs. Disoriented, he found himself sprawled across the Italian leather sofa in his penthouse living room, an empty whiskey tumbler lying on its side next to an expensive bottle of Macallan 25. The amber liquid had pooled on the glass coffee table, reflecting the city lights that glittered far below through floor-to-ceiling windows. For a moment, he thought the scream had been real. Then reality settled in. Just another nightmare, the same one that had haunted him for months now. A faceless child crying out for help, a help he never provided. The digital clock on the wall displayed 3:42 a.m., another sleepless night in a string of many. Alexander ran his hands through his silver-streaked hair, once meticulously styled, now disheveled from restless sleep. At 54, his face still commanded respect. Strong jawline, penetrating blue eyes, the kind of features that financial magazines loved to put on their covers. The Oracle of Boston, they called him. The tech visionary who had built pinnacle technologies from nothing into a behemoth worth billions. The phone rang, shattering the silence. Who would call at this hour? Only someone who knew he'd be awake. "What is it, Vanessa?" he answered without checking the caller ID. The Asian markets opened. Pinnacle dropped another 15%. Vanessa Wilson's voice was steady, controlled. His executive assistant of 7 years never showed panic, even when delivering catastrophic news. "The board is calling an emergency meeting for 7 a.m. Blake wants your resignation letter on his desk before then." Alexander closed his eyes. "Tell Blake he can go to hell." "I already did," in more diplomatic terms. A pause. "Should I come over? We could prepare a strategy." "No. I need to think." After hanging up, Alexander walked to the window. From his penthouse on the 60th floor, Boston spread before him like a jeweled tapestry. Half those lights belonged to buildings he owned. The other half to companies he controlled through investments and board seats. By any measure, he was one of the most powerful men in New England. And yet, he pressed his forehead against the cool glass. When had success begun to taste like ashes in his mouth? The framed photograph on the credenza caught his eye. A younger version of himself stood beside a beautiful woman with auburn hair, Mary Ann, his ex-wife. They were smiling, their arms wrapped around each other in front of the small office where Pinnacle had begun, back when he was still building something that mattered, not just accumulating wealth. "You were right to leave," he whispered to her image. "I became everything we swore to fight against." 15 years ago, Pinnacle Technologies had a mission statement that meant something: technology to elevate humanity. They had developed assistive devices for disabled veterans, medical diagnostic software for underserved communities, educational platforms that brought knowledge to remote villages across the world. Now Pinnacle optimized advertising algorithms to sell more products to people who didn't need them, collected user data to predict consumer behavior, developed social media features designed to maximize addiction and engagement. Alexander turned away from the photograph. The truth was stark in the empty expanse of his penthouse. 60 million for the property, another 20 for the furnishings, and not a single space that felt like home. As dawn crept over the horizon, Alexander dressed methodically, armoring himself in a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than what most Americans earned in 3 months. The board wanted blood. They would get a show instead. Vanessa was waiting when his private elevator opened into Pinnacle's executive floor. At 38, she was striking rather than beautiful, with sharp cheekbones, dark hair cut in a severe bob, and eyes that missed nothing. She wore a perfectly tailored black dress that somehow conveyed both professionalism and subtle feminine power. Her third husband had filed for divorce last month. Alexander had sent flowers. Professional sympathy, nothing more. "They're waiting in the Asimov conference room," she said, falling into step beside him. "I've prepared counter-arguments for every point they'll raise. The Q3 projections, the development delays, the exodus of senior engineers. We can contain this." "How many shares has Blake accumulated?" Alexander asked, not breaking stride as they moved down the corridor, lined with awards and magazine covers featuring his face. Vanessa hesitated just for a heartbeat. 23%, with his allies potentially 40%. Almost enough for a hostile takeover. "Almost," she agreed, "but not quite." The boardroom fell silent when Alexander entered. 12 faces turned toward him with expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed hostility. At the far end, Blake Morrison, silver-haired, square-jawed, with the predatory stillness of a shark circling wounded prey. Alex, Blake nodded, using the diminutive form Alexander had always despised. We were beginning to think you might not join us. It's my company, Blake. Where else would I be? That's precisely what we need to discuss. Blake gestured to a thick folder before him. Pinnacle has lost 38% of its market value in 9 months. 4 major projects are behind schedule. Our best talent is fleeing to competitors. The board believes the company needs new leadership. Alexander looked around the table. These men and women had been colleagues, some even friends. Now they stared back with the cold calculation of investors protecting their assets. New leadership, Alexander repeated softly. You mean your leadership, Blake? I've prepared a transition plan that would be minimally disruptive to operations while you dismantle everything Pinnacle was built to be. Alexander's voice remained low, but something in his tone made several board members shift uncomfortably in their seats. You want to spin off the medical division, sell the educational platforms, double down on data harvesting and targeted advertising. Blake's jaw tightened. I want to maximize shareholder value. That's our fiduciary duty. Is that all we owe the world, Prophet? The question hung in the air. In the silence, Alexander felt something crack inside him. A dam breaking after years of pressure. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. Reed, Blake called after him. If you walk out now, there won't be a way back. Alexander paused at the threshold, not turning around. Good. Vanessa caught up with him at the elevator, her expression a mixture of shock and calculation. What are you doing? This is exactly what Blake wants. Give him 48 hours and he'll have the votes to remove you. Let me know how it goes, Alexander said, stepping into the elevator. Wait. She placed her hand on the door, stopping it from closing. Where are you going? I'll clear your schedule and join you. Something in her eagerness made Alexander pause. Vanessa had never left his side during a crisis. Her loyalty had been absolute. But for the first time, he found himself wondering about the nature of that loyalty. No need, he said gently. I just need some air. Her hand lingered on the door. Alexander, please, we're a team. Are we? He looked at her more closely than he had in years. What exactly are we, Vanessa? A flicker of something alarm calculation crossed her features before her professional mask returned. I'm the person who's protected you from yourself for 7 years. Don't forget that. The elevator doors closed between them. For the first time in decades, Alexander Reed walked the streets of Boston without a security detail, without a driver trailing him, without a destination programmed into his phone. The morning air was crisp, carrying the first hint of autumn. Around him, the city pulsed with life students hurrying to classes, office workers clutching coffee cups, street vendors setting up their carts. Alexander moved among them invisible despite his expensive suit. Nobody recognized the face from the magazine covers when it wasn't framed by power and prestige. He walked for hours, leaving the gleaming towers of the financial district behind, wandering through neighborhoods where real people lived real lives. In the north end, the scent of fresh bread stopped him in his tracks. A small bakery with a faded sign, Sullivan's Bread and Coffee asked, 19... The windows were fogged with condensation, the interior warm and inviting. Something drew him inside. Perhaps hunger, perhaps nostalgia for a simpler time. The bell above the door jangled softly as he entered. The space was modest but immaculate, worn wooden counters polished to a soft glow, glass cases displaying fresh pastries, a few small tables where customers lingered over coffee and conversation. No corporate branding, no digital menus, just a handwritten chalkboard and the rich aroma of baking bread. Behind the counter stood an older man with thick forearms dusted with flour, his white hair visible beneath a baker's cap. He looked up as Alexander entered, offering a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Morning, the baker greeted him. Haven't seen you around before. Alexander approached the counter strangely hesitant. First time here. Well then, welcome to Sullivan's. I'm Patrick Sullivan, 3rd generation, though my son likes to remind me he'll be the 4th once I finally retire. The baker chuckled. What can I get for you? Alexander scanned the display case, overwhelmed by simple choices after years of having personal chefs prepare his meals to exacting nutritional specifications. What do you recommend? Patrick's eyes twinkled. Depends. Are you eating for your body or your soul today? The question caught Alexander off guard. When had anyone last asked him something so human? My soul, I think, he answered finally. Patrick nodded as if this made perfect sense. Sourdough cinnamon roll and black coffee, strong enough to make your ancestors sit up straight. Alexander accepted both with a nod of thanks and took a seat by the window. The first bite of the pastry nearly brought tears to his eyes. Not because it was the finest thing he'd ever tasted, he had dined at Michelin-starred restaurants around the world, but because it tasted real, made by human hands that cared about the result. For 20 minutes, Alexander sat in that humble bakery, watching the neighborhood come alive outside the window. Patrick chatted easily with regulars who came and went, calling many by name, asking about children, spouses, health concerns. A community, Alexander realized, something he had once dreamed of building through technology. When he finally rose to leave, he left a $100 bill on the counter. Patrick raised an eyebrow. Your change, sir. Keep it. The conversation was worth far more. The baker studied him for a moment, then slid the bill back across the counter. First-time customers pay regular prices. You want to be generous, you come back and become a regular. That's how community works. Chastened and strangely moved, Alexander paid the proper amount. As he turned to leave, his expensive leather wallet slipped unnoticed from his coat pocket, landing silently on the floor near the door. Outside, the afternoon sun warmed his face as he walked with no particular destination. For the first time in years, his mind was quiet, not racing with stock prices and product deadlines and competitive analyses. He felt human, small in a way that was oddly comforting. Just one man in a city of millions and all carrying their own stories. Meanwhile, in a cluttered office at Pinnacle Technologies, Vanessa Wilson closed the door and locked it before making a call. He walked out, she said without preamble when the line connected, right in the middle of the board meeting. As you predicted, replied Martin Green, his lawyer's voice smooth and measured. Where is he now? I don't know. He wouldn't let me join him. Vanessa moved to the window, gazing out at the city as if she might spot Alexander among the crowds below. He seemed different. Asked me what we really are to each other. Getting sentimental at the finish line, Martin chuckled. Stick to the plan, Vanessa. We're too close to waver now. 3 more months of strategic mismanagement and Pinnacle stock will be low enough for our investment group to make their move. And Alexander might have to. He'll be too busy fighting Blake's takeover attempt to notice our position until it's too late. By then, we'll own enough shares to force a shareholder vote. You have his proxy rights for most of his personal holdings, correct? Vanessa smiled thinly. Of course, he trusts me implicitly. Then we proceed as planned. After ending the call, Vanessa unlocked Alexander's private office with her security key. The system logged her entry, but she had long ago installed a backdoor in the security software to erase such records. Inside the pristine space, she moved directly to his computer, entering the password she had watched him type countless times. Minutes later, she had accessed confidential files on upcoming product launches, forwarding them to a secure server and only she and Martin could access. Next, she made subtle alterations to several email threads, changing dates and expectations in ways that would only become apparent weeks later when projects inevitably failed to meet their targets. A text alert vibrated her phone. Board members Blake, Chen, and Rodriguez requesting private meeting tomorrow. Confidence vote likely. Perfect. The wolves were circling faster than expected. Every crisis of confidence in Alexander's leadership pushed Pinnacle's stock lower, making their eventual acquisition cheaper. Vanessa had not spent 7 years as the faithful executive assistant just to remain one. She had higher aspirations. And Alexander Reed, for all his brilliance, had a fatal flaw. He trusted people. Specifically, he trusted her. That would be his undoing. Across the city, in a dilapidated apartment building in East Boston, 7-year-old Sophie Johnson listened for the telltale sound of her aunt snoring. The tiny bedroom she shared with her 5-year-old brother Ethan was barely large enough for their twin mattresses on the floor. Water stains marked the ceiling where rain leaked through during storms. A single light bulb hung from a frayed cord, casting harsh shadows across peeling wallpaper. Sophie sat on the edge of her mattress, watching Ethan sleep fitfully. His breathing was labored, each inhale a wheezing struggle that tore at her heart. The medication for his congenital heart condition sat empty on the milk crate between their beds. They needed a refill, but Aunt Caroline had taken the prescription card 3 days ago, promising to get it filled. Sophie knew what that meant. The medication money had gone into Caroline's bottle fund instead. Carefully, she slipped from the bed and crept to the living room. Caroline Evans lay sprawled on the threadbare couch, an empty vodka bottle on the floor beside her. The woman's face, once pretty according to the photograph Sophie had seen of her with Mom, now appeared haggard and bitter even in sleep. Mascara smeared beneath her eyes like bruises. Sophie checked Caroline's purse, finding only loose change and crumpled receipts from the liquor store. No prescription card, no medication for Ethan. Returning to their room, Sophie gently shook her brother awake. "Ethan," she whispered, "we need to go find food. Are you strong enough to walk?" The little boy nodded, though his face was pale and his lips had a bluish tinge that frightened Sophie. Since the car accident 6 months ago that had killed their mother and left their father in a coma, Sophie had become Ethan's protector. She helped him dress, tying his shoes with the careful precision Mom had taught her, then wrapped him in their shared winter coat, too large for him, but it was all they had. "Where's Aunt Caroline?" Ethan asked, his voice small. "A leaping," Sophie replied, the word a euphemism they both understood. "We'll be back before she wakes up." They slipped out of the apartment and down the stairwell that smelled of urine, and cigarettes. Outside, the October air bit through their inadequate clothing. Sophie took Ethan's hand, feeling the slight tremble in his small fingers. "The bakery man sometimes gives us bread at the end of the day," she reminded him, trying to sound confident. "And maybe we can find some cans in the recycling bins for money." They had been doing this for weeks now, scavenging for food when Caroline forgot to buy groceries or spent the food stamps on herself. Sophie had learned which restaurants put unspoiled leftovers in separate bags, which markets discarded produce that was still good enough to eat, which kindly shopkeepers might slip them a day-old sandwich if they arrived at the right time. Today they headed toward the North End, where the Italian restaurants sometimes left good food in accessible bins. It was farther than they usually traveled, but Sophie was desperate. Ethan needed food to take with his medication if they could find any. As they walked, Ethan's breathing grew more labored. Sophie stopped frequently to let him rest, anxiety gnawing at her stomach. His lips were definitely bluer. The doctor at the free clinic had warned about this. When his heart couldn't pump efficiently, his blood didn't get enough oxygen. "Just a little farther," she encouraged, though she had no idea what they would find or how she would help him. They passed Sullivan's Bakery just as the afternoon crowd was thinning. Sophie pressed her face against the glass, watching customers inside enjoy warm bread and coffee. Her stomach growled painfully. They hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, a shared bowl of cereal with water because the milk had gone bad. "Let's wait by the back door," she told Ethan. "Maybe Mr. Sullivan will have leftovers again." They circled around to the alley behind the bakery, Ethan leaning heavily against his sister now. As they approached the back door, Sophie spotted something on the ground near the corner of the building, something that gleamed in the fading afternoon light. A wallet, black leather, expensive looking. Sophie froze, her heart suddenly racing. Stealing was wrong. Mom had been clear about that, but Ethan needed his medicine. They needed food. With trembling hands, she picked up the wallet and opened it. Inside was more cash than she had ever seen, several $100 bills, crisp and new. Credit cards with gold and platinum emblems. A driver's license for someone named Alexander Reed. Ethan started coughing, a harsh, painful sound that made Sophie's decision for her. She hesitated only a moment before removing $100 bill, enough for Ethan's medication and food for a few days. Just until Caroline got the prescription filled. Just until Dad woke up. Just until things got better. Tears blurred her vision as she fumbled in her pocket for a pencil stub and a scrap of notebook paper. Her handwriting was careful, each letter formed with precision as her second-grade teacher had taught her. "I'm sorry, my brother is dying from heart disease. I only took enough money for his medicine and food. I promise to work and pay you back every penny. Please don't call the police. Our aunt will hurt us. Sophie, age 7. She placed the note inside the wallet on top of the remaining money and closed it reverently. The weight of what she'd done pressed down on her small shoulders. Mom would be disappointed. But Mom wasn't here and Ethan couldn't breathe right, and Sophie had to be the grown-up now. What's that? Ethan asked weakly, noticing the wallet in her hand. Someone lost it, Sophie explained. We're going to give it back, but first we need to get your medicine. She tucked the wallet safely back where she'd found it, making sure it was visible. Then she helped Ethan to his feet, the $100 bill clutched tightly in her hand, burning with both possibility and shame. Come on, she whispered. Let's find a pharmacy before it gets dark. As they shuffled away, Sophie looked back once at the wallet that might save her brother's life. She didn't see Patrick Sullivan watching from the bakery window, his kind eyes taking in everything. The next morning dawned clear and cool over Boston. Alexander Reed woke in his penthouse after the first decent night's sleep he'd had in months. Something about walking the city, about sitting in that simple bakery, had quieted the demons that usually kept him awake. The peace lasted until he reached for his wallet to leave a tip for the housekeeper. Empty pocket, then another. Jacket, pants from yesterday, briefcase, everywhere he might have placed it. Gone. Alexander felt a flash of irritation, then resignation. The wallet contained several thousand in cash, multiple credit cards, his driver's license and access cards to his various properties. All replaceable, but an inconvenience. Retracing his steps mentally, he realized the last place he definitely remembered having, it was at Sullivan's Bakery. He'd paid for his coffee and rolled in. 20 minutes later, his private car dropped him at the North End Bakery. The morning rush was in full swing, the small shop crowded with customers picking up bread and pastries for the day. Patrick Sullivan worked efficiently behind the counter, his movements practiced and precise despite his age. When there was a lull, Alexander approached. Excuse me, Mr. Sullivan, I was here yesterday afternoon and I believe I may have lost my wallet. Patrick's eyes lit with recognition. Mr. Soul Food, he said with a smile. I was hoping you'd come back. He reached beneath the counter and produced a familiar black leather wallet. This yours? Alexander felt a surge of relief. Yes, thank you. He reached for it, then hesitated at Patrick's expression. You might want to look inside first, the baker said quietly. There's something you should see. Puzzled, Alexander opened the wallet. The credit cards were there. Most of the cash seemed present, but on top lay a folded piece of notebook paper, the edges worn, the handwriting, childlike but careful. He read it once, then again his hand suddenly unsteady. I'm sorry, my brother is dying from heart disease. I only took enough money for his medicine and food. I promise to work and pay you back every penny. Please don't call the police. Our aunt will hurt us. Sophie, age 7. Something broke inside Alexander Reed's chest. A wall he had built years ago, brick by brick, to protect himself from feeling too much, from caring too deeply. The simple, desperate honesty of those words from a child he'd never met shattered that barrier in an instant. A child who had nothing had taken only what was needed to save her brother and promised to repay it, while he who had everything had spent decades taking more than he needed and giving nothing back. When, he managed to ask, his voice rough. Patrick wiped his hands on his apron. Yesterday evening, 2 children. The little boy looked real sick, blue around the lips, having trouble breathing. The girl was trying to hold him up. They've been coming around for weeks, usually asking for day-old bread. I give them what I can, but... He shrugged helplessly. There are limits to what bread can fix. Do you know where they live? East Boston somewhere. That's all I know. Patrick studied Alexander's face. You're not angry about the money. Alexander looked down at the note again, at the carefully formed letters that must have taken such concentration for small fingers to produce. No, he said softly. I'm not angry. He folded the note and returned it to his wallet, suddenly certain of what he needed to do. If they come back, he told Patrick, please tell them I want to meet them. Not to take the money back. To help. Patrick nodded slowly. I'll tell them, but children who've been hurt by adults don't trust easily, Mr. Reed, Alexander Reed. He handed Patrick a business card. Call me directly if you see them again. Anytime, day or night. As Alexander turned to leave, Patrick called after him. What makes a man like you care about 2 homeless kids? Alexander paused at the door, looking back at the baker. Because they reminded me of something I forgot a long time ago. What's that, Bana? That wealth without compassion is poverty of the worst kind. With those words, Alexander Reed stepped back into the Boston morning, the note burning in his pocket like a challenge and a promise. For the first time in years, he had a purpose beyond profit margins and market share. He would find these children. He would help them. And perhaps in doing so, he might find his way back to the man he had once hoped to become. Alexander Reed stared at the phone in his hand, willing it to ring. 3 days had passed since he'd discovered the note from young Sophie, and each hour seemed to stretch longer than the last. He'd visited Sullivan's bakery twice daily, hoping the children might return, but Patrick had seen no sign of them. The penthouse that had once felt like a pristine showcase of his success now seemed hollow, its vastness an indictment of his solitude. Alexander paced across the Italian marble floor. Sophie's note unfolded before him on the coffee table. Each time he read it, the carefully formed letters struck him anew. "My brother is dying. Our aunt will hurt us." The intercom buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Reed, Marcus Delgado is here to see you," announced his building's concierge. "Send him up." Minutes later, a stocky man with salt and pepper hair and the watchful eyes of someone who had seen humanity at its worst stepped from the elevator. Marcus Delgado had served 20 years with Boston PD before retiring to establish his private investigation firm. His reputation was impeccable, thorough, discreet, and surprisingly compassionate for someone who had walked through the darkest corners of human behavior. "Mr. Reed," Delgado extended a calloused hand. "You said it was urgent." Alexander led him to the living room where Sophie's note lay beside a tumbler of untouched scotch. "I need to find these children." He handed the note to Delgado, who read it with an expressionless face that nevertheless somehow conveyed he'd seen far worse. "When did you get this?" "3 days ago. The girl Sophie took $100 from my wallet, but left this note. Her brother is sick, heart disease, Barney's." Delgado studied the handwriting. 7 years old, she says. Mentions an aunt who's abusive. He looked up. "What exactly are you hoping to do if we find them, Mr. Reed?" The question caught Alexander off guard. What was he planning? He hadn't thought beyond finding them, ensuring they were safe, getting medical help for the boy. "I want to help them," he said finally. "The boy needs medical attention. They need proper care. With all due respect, sir, you can't just take in random children you find on the street. There are laws, procedures. If the aunt is their legal guardian, then she should be reported for child abuse and neglect." Alexander cut in an edge, entering his voice. "I'm not trying to kidnap them, Delgado. I want to make sure they're safe, get the boy medical treatment, and find out who's responsible for their situation." The investigator nodded, seemingly satisfied. "I'll need more information. Physical descriptions, last known location, any details about the aunt." Alexander relayed what little Patrick Sullivan had told him: 2 children, the boy appearing seriously ill, frequent visits to the bakery asking for leftover bread. "Not much to go on," Delgado admitted, pocketing the notebook where he'd jotted notes. "But I've found people with less. I'll start with hospitals and clinics in East Boston. A child with heart disease should have medical records somewhere." He paused. "This won't be cheap, Mr. Reed. I'll need to put my full team on it. Money is no object. Just find them." After Delgado left, Alexander reached for his phone, scrolling to a contact he hadn't called in years. Rachel Stevens had been 3 years behind him at Harvard Law before he dropped out to launch his first startup. She'd gone on to become one of Boston's most respected child advocacy attorneys, fighting for kids that the system too often forgot. She answered on the third ring. "Alexander Reed," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "The market crash finally hit, or are you calling to donate to our legal fund?" Despite everything, Alexander smiled. Rachel had never been impressed by his wealth or status, a quality he'd once found irritating and now found refreshing. "Neither. I need advice on a situation involving 2 children who may be in danger." He could almost see her arching an eyebrow. "And you're suddenly interested in child welfare because I can help and I should." The words came out more forcefully than he'd intended. A pause. "Well, that's new. All right, I'm listening." Alexander explained the situation, reading Sophie's note verbatim. As he spoke, Rachel's tone shifted from skeptical to professional concern. "If what the girl wrote is true, this is a clear case for Child Protective Services. But you need to understand something, Alexander. The system is overwhelmed, underfunded, and often works at a glacial pace. Even in cases of obvious abuse, removing children from guardians takes time and evidence." "I don't have time," Alexander replied, thinking of the little boy's blue-tinged lips Patrick had described. The child could die waiting for the system to work. "What exactly are you proposing?" Rachel's voice took on a warning tone. "I don't know yet, but when we find them, I want options. legal options. You're personally involving yourself in this. Alexander thought of the empire he'd built, the billions accumulating in his accounts, while children went hungry within miles of his penthouse. Yes, I am. A long sigh came through the line. Then you're going to need more than just my advice. Come to my office tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. And Alexander, be prepared for a reality check about how child protection actually works in America. As Alexander ended the call, his phone buzzed with a message from Vanessa. Board vote scheduled for Friday. Blake has 42% support now. We need to talk strategy immediately. He switched the phone off without replying. Across the city, in a sleek high-rise that housed some of Boston's most prestigious law firms, Vanessa Wilson sat across from Martin Green in his corner office. The attorney's silver hair and tailored suit projected an image of distinguished trustworthiness that had helped him build a client roster of Boston's elite. Blake is moving faster than anticipated, Vanessa said, sliding a folder across the polished mahogany desk. These are the latest board voting projections. He'll have majority support by Friday unless Alexander makes a dramatic comeback. Green scanned the documents, nodding slowly. Perfect. Let Blake think he's winning. When the dust settles, he'll find himself outvoted by our investor coalition. He looked up. What's Alexander doing to fight back? Nothing. Vanessa frowned. He's completely disengaged. Won't return my calls, canceled all his meetings. It's like he's given up. That's unexpected. Green's eyes narrowed. Alexander Reed doesn't give up. He's planning something. I thought so too at first, but my sources say he's not meeting with bankers or lawyers or other board members. He hired a private investigator, though. To investigate whom? I don't know, but it's not corporate espionage. The PI specializes in finding missing persons. Green leaned back, fingers forming a steeple beneath his chin. Interesting. Make sure your tracks are covered. The last thing we need is Alexander discovering our position before we're ready to move. My tracks are always covered. Vanessa stood smoothing her skirt with manicured fingers. But there's something else. Something odd. Go on. He's been visiting some bakery in the North End, twice a day sometimes, just sitting there for hours. And yesterday he met with Rachel Stevens. The children's rights attorney, Green frowned. Why would his phone buzzed, interrupting him? He checked the screen. We'll have to continue this later. My next appointment is here. As Vanessa reached the door, he added, Stay close to Alexander. Whatever he's doing, I want to know about it. After Vanessa left, Green's phone rang again. He answered immediately. Caroline, what's wrong? You never call me at the office. I think I'm being watched. Carolyn Evans' voice was slurred, high-pitched with anxiety. There was a man asking questions at the corner store. About children? About me. Green's face hardened. Where are the kids now? Home. Where else would they be? A defensive note entered her voice. I'm not a bad guardian, Martin. I just need more money. The boys' medications are expensive. We've discussed this, Caroline. The children are your responsibility until the inheritance is secured. Then you'll be generously compensated. But that's months away. The boy needs his prescription refilled. The social worker is due for a visit next week, and if she sees, I'll have more money sent over today. Just keep those children out of the system until everything is finalized. Remember, if they end up in foster care, you get nothing. After hanging up, Green stared out his window at the Boston skyline, tapping his fingers rhythmically on the desk. Carolyn Evans was becoming a liability. The woman's addiction issues were worsening, making her increasingly unreliable. But she was a necessary piece of the puzzle for now. 5 years ago, when Martin had discovered the trust fund established for David Johnson's children, he'd recognized an opportunity. The accident that killed Jessica Johnson and left David in a coma had been tragic, yes, but also fortuitous. With both parents out of the picture and the children under Caroline's guardianship, controlling the substantial inheritance would be simple. Caroline had been easy to manipulate, a distant friend of the family with addiction issues and financial troubles, eager to take custody in exchange for access to the monthly care stipend. What Martin hadn't anticipated was Alexander Reed's sudden interest in the welfare of 2 random street children. It was an inconvenience, but not insurmountable. After all, what could a billionaire tech CEO possibly want with 2 homeless kids unless he somehow knew about the trust fund? But that was impossible. Green picked up his phone and dialed another number. I need enhanced surveillance on Alexander Reed, immediately. The next morning, Alexander sat in Rachel Stevens' modest office in a converted brownstone near the courthouse. Unlike the sleek corporate law firms he usually frequented, this space was designed for comfort rather than intimidation. Warm colors, comfortable seating, children's drawings framed on the walls alongside diplomas and certifications. Rachel handed him a steaming mug of coffee. At 45, she retained the intense focus and sharp intelligence that had made her a formidable law student. Her curly hair was now streaked with gray, and fine lines had formed at the corners of her eyes, but her gaze was as penetrating as ever. "Before we start," she said, settling behind her desk, "I need to know exactly what you're hoping to accomplish here." Alexander set down the coffee untouched. "I want to find these children, get medical help for the boy, and ensure they're both safe from their abusive guardian. And then, I don't know." He met her gaze directly. "I just know I can't walk away." Rachel studied him for a long moment. The Alexander Reed I knew would never have gotten involved in something so messy, so human. What changed? Maybe I got tired of who I'd become. He didn't elaborate further. She seemed to accept this, opening a folder on her desk. "All right, here's what you need to understand about the child welfare system in Massachusetts. It's designed with one primary goal: family reunification. Even in cases of substantiated abuse, the courts generally prefer to provide services to the family rather than remove the children permanently, even if the guardian is hurting them. Unless the children are in imminent danger, and that's a high bar. Yes, the process typically begins with an investigation by DCF, which can take weeks. If abuse is substantiated, there's a care and protection petition, court hearings, temporary custody arrangements. It's a lengthy process." Alexander's frustration mounted. This boy needs medical attention now, today, not after months of legal proceedings. "I understand that, which is why we need to work within the system, but with urgency." Rachel leaned forward. "If we can locate these children, I can file an emergency petition for temporary custody based on medical neglect. That would allow immediate intervention, especially if the boy's condition is as serious as you described." "How quickly could that happen?" "If we can document the medical neglect and find a judge willing to issue an emergency order, potentially within hours." But she emphasized, raising a finger, "We need evidence. The note alone isn't enough." Alexander nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. "My investigator is working on locating them now. Once he does..." His phone rang the screen, displaying Delgado's number. "Speak of the devil," he muttered, answering quickly. "Delgado, what have you found?" The PI's voice came through clearly. "I've got something, Mr. Reed. Medical records for an Ethan Johnson, age 5, diagnosed with congenital heart disease. Multiple ER visits in the past 6 months, last one 3 days ago. Boston Children's Hospital." Alexander's pulse quickened. The sister, Sophie Johnson, age 7, same address in East Boston. Guardian listed as Caroline Evans' maternal aunt. Get this, the father, David Johnson, isn't dead. He's in a long-term care facility. Coma patient following a car accident that killed the mother 6 months ago. You're certain these are our children? Description matches. The boy's medical condition matches. And hospital records note concerns about medication adherence and possible neglect. They filed 2 reports with DCF already. Alexander looked at Rachel, who was watching him intently. "Text me the address, and Delgado, find out everything you can about Caroline Evans." After ending the call, he relayed the information to Rachel, whose expression had turned grimly professional. "This changes things," she said, reaching for her phone. "With existing DCF reports and documented medical neglect, we can move much faster. I'm calling Judge Hoffman now. She's handled cases like this before." As Rachel made the call, Alexander felt a strange mixture of emotions: relief at having found the children, anger at the system that had allowed them to fall through the cracks, and something else, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in decades. Outside the windows, dark clouds gathered as an unseasonable storm approached Boston. The weather matched his mood, a gathering tempest, potential energy waiting to be released. An hour later, Alexander's driver navigated through increasingly narrow streets in East Boston. The elegant high-rises of downtown gave way to triple-deckers and walk-up apartments, many showing signs of neglect: peeling paint, sagging porches, windows covered with plastic against the coming winter. "This is it," the driver announced, pulling up before a dingy, three-story building with crumbling brick facade. Wait here, Alexander instructed, stepping out into the biting wind. Rachel joined him on the sidewalk, her professional attire looking out of place in this neighborhood. Remember, she cautioned, we're here to document the situation and serve the emergency custody order if Judge Hoffman approves it. We are not removing the children without legal authority. Alexander nodded tersely, already moving toward the building's entrance. The front door hung slightly ajar, its security buzzer long since broken. Inside the hallway smelled of mildew and boiled cabbage, the walls marked with graffiti and decades of grime. Third floor apartment 3C, Rachel said, consulting her notes. They climbed the stairs in silence, the treads creaking beneath their weight. As they reached the third floor landing, a door slammed somewhere above them, followed by raised voices and the sound of breaking glass. Alexander quickened his pace, Rachel hurrying behind him. Apartment 3C's door was dented and scratched the number, hanging askew from a single screw. Alexander raised his hand to knock, then froze as a child's cry pierced the thin walls. "You worthless little, I told you to be quiet." A woman's voice slurred and vicious. "Where's your sister? Where is she?" Another crash followed by frightened sobbing. Alexander's control shattered. He pounded on the door with a closed fist. "Open up now." Silence fell inside the apartment. Then shuffling footsteps approached. The door cracked open, revealing a woman in her 40s with bleached blonde hair and mascara smudged beneath bloodshot eyes. She swayed slightly, the sharp tang of alcohol emanating from her. "Who the hell are you?" she demanded, her gaze traveling from Alexander's expensive coat to Rachel's professional demeanor. "Caroline Evans." Rachel stepped forward, her voice calm but authoritative. "I'm Rachel Stevens, an attorney. We're here concerning Sophie and Ethan Johnson." Caroline's eyes narrowed. "They're not here. Go away." She tried to close the door, but Alexander's palm slammed against it, holding it open. "We heard the boy crying. We know they're here. You can't just—" "Ms. Evans," Rachel interrupted smoothly. "We have concerns about the children's welfare, particularly Ethan's medical care. We'd like to speak with them." "You got a warrant," Caroline sneered. "We have an emergency custody petition pending with the court," Rachel replied. "It would be better for everyone if you cooperated voluntarily." From behind Caroline, a small voice called out weakly, "Aunt Caroline, who is it?" Alexander's heart clenched at the sound. "Ethan." Caroline glanced over her shoulder nervously. "Nobody. Go back to your room." "Ms. Evans," Alexander said, his voice dangerously quiet, "I strongly suggest you let us in. Now." Something in his tone made the woman falter. Her gaze flicked between them, calculating her options. Finally, she stepped back, pulling the door wider. "Fine, come in, but don't expect much. I do what I can on what the state gives me, which ain't much." The apartment that greeted them was a study in neglect. Dirty dishes piled in the sink, empty bottles clustered on every surface. The furniture was stained and broken, the carpet threadbare. A sour smell permeated everything, unwashed laundry, rotting food, and, beneath it all, the unmistakable scent of illness. In the center of this squalor stood a small boy, thin to the point of frailty, with dark circles beneath eyes too old for his 5 years. His breathing was audibly labored, each inhale a wheezing struggle. When he saw the strangers, he shrank back, pressing himself against the wall. "Hello, Ethan," Rachel said gently, crouching to his level. "My name is Rachel. This is Alexander. We're here to help you and your sister. Is Sophie here too?" The boy's eyes widened with fear. He shook his head frantically. "She ran off." Carolyn interjected, attempting to smooth her rumpled clothing. "Ungrateful little brat. I take them in after my sister dies, and this is the thanks I get. The girl's nothing but trouble." "When did she leave?" Alexander demanded, scanning the apartment for signs of the 7-year-old who had written that heartbreaking note. "This morning, after I told her I couldn't afford more of his fancy medications." Carolyn gestured dismissively toward Ethan. "Not my fault the insurance won't cover all of it." Alexander's phone buzzed with a text. Glancing down, he saw it was from Judge Hoffman via Rachel's office. "Emergency custody order granted for both children. Police en route to assist." He showed the message to Rachel, who nodded almost imperceptibly before turning back to Carolyn. "Ms. Evans, Judge Hoffman has granted an emergency custody order for Sophie and Ethan Johnson based on evidence of medical neglect and unsafe living conditions. The children will be temporarily removed from your care pending a full hearing." Caroline's face contorted with fury. You can't do that. I'm their legal guardian. A guardian who has failed to provide necessary medical care and basic necessities. Rachel countered, her tone hardening. Where is Ethan's medication? I told you I couldn't afford. The state provides full coverage for his condition, Rachel cut in. The prescription was filled last week according to pharmacy records. Where is it? Caroline's gaze slid away, her hands fidgeting. I don't know what you're talking about. Alexander had heard enough. He knelt beside Ethan, who watched him with wary eyes. Ethan, we need to find your sister. Do you know where she might go when she's scared? The boy hesitated, glancing fearfully at his aunt. Then in a whisper so faint, Alexander had to lean closer. The bridge, by the water, where Mommy used to take us. Alexander nodded, keeping his expression calm despite the rage building inside him at what these children had endured. Thank you for telling me. We're going to help you both, I promise. He stood addressing Rachel. The police will be here soon. I'm going to find Sophie before this storm hits full force. Rachel nodded. Go. I'll stay with Ethan until the officers arrive. As Alexander headed for the door, Caroline lunged forward, grabbing his arm with surprising strength. You can't take them. I need the money. The words hung in the air, damning in their naked greed. Alexander shook off her grip, disgust evident in every line of his face. The only thing you need, he said coldly, is a good lawyer, because when I'm done, you'll be facing charges for every bruise, every missed medication, every moment of suffering these children endured under your care. Outside, the first heavy raindrops splattered against the sidewalk as the storm closed in. Alexander pulled his coat tighter, scanning the darkening streets for any sign of a small girl seeking shelter. The bridge by the water. It wasn't much to go on in a city with dozens of bridges, but he had a hunch Ethan meant somewhere close by, somewhere familiar. His phone rang. Delgado again. I've got more on Caroline Evans, the investigator reported without preamble. She's got priors for drug possession, fraud, and child endangerment with a previous foster placement. But here's the interesting part. She's been making regular calls to a law firm downtown. Green and Associates. Alexander frowned. Martin Green. What would someone like Caroline Evans want with one of Boston's most expensive attorneys? That's not all. Evans has been receiving wire transfers from an offshore account linked to a shell company. $5,000 first of every month, starting right after she became guardian to the Johnson children. The pieces began falling into place in Alexander's mind. Someone's paying her to keep those kids. Find out why Delgado, and dig deeper into the parents' background, particularly any assets or insurance policies. He ended the call, his instincts as a businessman now fully aligned with his newfound determination to protect Sophie and Ethan. Someone was using these children, and he intended to find out who and why. The rain intensified, driven sideways by gusting winds that cut through even his expensive wool coat. Alexander moved quickly through the streets of East Boston, heading toward the waterfront. The temperature was dropping rapidly. Soon the rain would turn to sleet, then snow. If Sophie was out in this weather without proper clothing or shelter, he pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on scanning every alley, every doorway, every possible hiding place a frightened child might seek. As he neared the harbor and the wind grew stronger, carrying the tang of salt and diesel from the shipping terminals, a flash of movement caught his eye, a small figure darting between two warehouses, a flash of pink amid the industrial gray. Alexander changed direction, breaking into a run despite the slippery pavement. Sophie, he called, his voice nearly lost in the howling wind. Sophie Johnson. The figure froze, then bolted like a startled deer. Alexander pursued his longer strides, closing the distance despite the child's desperate flight. As he rounded the corner of the warehouse, he spotted her, a tiny girl in a too large pink jacket, her dark hair plastered to her pale face by the driving rain. She backed away from him, eyes wide with terror, until her shoulders hit the chain-link fence that separated the dock area from the water beyond. Stay away, she shouted, her voice thin with fear. I'll scream. Alexander stopped, maintaining a non-threatening distance. Sophie, he said gently, I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Alexander Reed. You found my wallet a few days ago. The girl's expression shifted from fear to wariness. The wallet, man? Yes, you left a note about your brother needing medicine. He reached slowly into his pocket and withdrew the folded paper, now protected in a plastic sleeve. This note. You wrote it. Sophie stared at the familiar paper recognition dawning in her eyes. You, you're not mad about the money? No, Sophie, I'm not mad. I'm worried about you and Ethan. That's why I've been looking for you. A violent shiver ran through the girl's small frame. Her lips were taking on a bluish tinge that alarmed Alexander. Hypothermia was a real danger in these conditions. Where's Ethan? She demanded. Did Aunt Caroline hurt him again? Ethan is safe, Alexander assured her, taking a careful step closer. He's with my friend Rachel, who's a lawyer that helps children. The police are there too, making sure your aunt can't hurt either of you again. Sophie's shoulders sagged with momentary relief, then tensed again. They'll split us up, put us in different foster homes. That's what Aunt Caroline always said. I won't let that happen, Alexander promised, his voice firm with conviction. Sophie, it's freezing out here. You need to come with me now before you get sick too. Another violent shiver racked her small body, but still she hesitated. Why do you care? Nobody cares about us. Not since Mom died and Dad. Her voice broke, and in that moment, she was simply a 7-year-old child who had lost everything and was desperately trying to hold what remained together. Alexander closed the distance between them, kneeling on the wet concrete despite his expensive suit, bringing himself to her eye level. I care because what you did was the bravest, most honest thing I've seen in a very long time, he said softly. You could have taken all the money in that wallet, but you only took what you needed for your brother's medicine. Then you promised to pay it back someday. That kind of honesty, it's rare, Sophie, and it matters. Fat tears mingled with the rain on the girl's cheeks. I didn't want to steal. Mom said stealing is wrong. But Ethan couldn't breathe right, and Aunt Caroline sold his medicine for drinking money, and I was scared he would die, and, her words dissolved into fume. Alexander opened his arms, and after a moment's hesitation, Sophie fell into them, her small body trembling with cold and emotion. It's going to be all right, he murmured, lifting her easily and wrapping his coat around her shivering form. I promise you, Sophie, things are going to get better now. As he carried her back toward the street where his driver waited, Alexander's phone rang again. Balancing Sophie carefully, he answered. Reed. It's Delgado. I found something big. David Johnson wasn't just some random guy. He was working on a new semiconductor technology before the accident. Had patents pending worth potentially billions. After the accident, someone filed paperwork transferring control of his intellectual property to a holding company. Let me guess, Alexander said grimly. A company connected to Martin Green. Better, a subsidiary of Pinnacle Technologies, specifically a division overseen by your trusted assistant, Vanessa Wilson. The pieces clicked together in Alexander's mind with sickening clarity. Vanessa had been orchestrating this, keeping David Johnson sedated in a long-term care facility, installing Caroline as the children's guardian to maintain control over them all, while preparing to steal the technology that could be worth billions. And she'd been doing it from inside his own company, under his nose. There's more, Delgado continued. The storm is getting worse. They're predicting power outages across the region, including at the care facility where David Johnson is being kept. Alexander felt Sophie shiver against his chest, her breathing growing steadier as she warmed within his coat. These children had already lost their mother. He wouldn't let them lose their father too. Where's the facility? He asked, reaching his car and carefully placing Sophie in the back seat. Riverside Care Center in Cambridge. But Reed, this storm is getting dangerous. The governor just issued a travel advisory. Alexander looked at Sophie huddled in the warmth of his car, then at the worsening blizzard outside. A choice was crystallizing before him: continue to the safety of his penthouse with Sophie, or risk the dangerous conditions to reach David Johnson before a potential power failure threatened the equipment keeping him alive. Call the facility, he instructed Delgado. Tell them to prepare David Johnson for immediate transfer to Boston General. I'll cover all costs. And contact Rachel, tell her what we've discovered about Vanessa and Green. As he ended the call, Alexander turned to his driver. Change of plans. We're going to Riverside Care Center in Cambridge. Fast as safely possible. The driver nodded grimly, putting the car in motion as sleet began to coat the windshield. In the back seat, Sophie looked up at Alexander with eyes that held both fear and the first fragile glimmers of hope. Where are we going? She asked, her voice small but steadier now. Alexander gently tucked a blanket around her. To save your father. As their car fought its way through the worsening storm, Alexander gazed out at the swirling snow, feeling a strange calm despite the dangers ahead. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what needed to be done. The storm might be raging, but within Alexander Reed, something long frozen was finally beginning to thaw. The world outside had disappeared beneath a swirling vortex of white. Snow hammered against the windshield of Alexander's car as they inched through Cambridge streets now nearly impassable. Wind howled around them, rocking the heavy vehicle whenever they slowed. Twice they'd nearly slid off the road, the driver's knuckles white as he gripped the wheel, fighting for control on the treacherous surface. In the back seat, Sophie had fallen into an exhausted sleep, her small body curled beneath Alexander's cashmere coat, her face finally peaceful after the terror of the day. Alexander watched her breathing, each rise and fall of her chest a small miracle after what she'd endured. The child had shown more courage and integrity in her 7 years than most adults managed in a lifetime. His phone vibrated. Rachel Stevens. "We're at Boston Children's Hospital," she reported without preamble. "Ethan's been admitted and is receiving treatment. His condition is serious but stable. The cardiologist says with proper medication and care, he should recover." And Caroline? In police custody. They found prescription medications in her purse, crushed into powder for resale. She's looking at multiple felony charges. Rachel paused. "Alexander Marcus Delgado told me about David Johnson and the connection to Vanessa Wilson. This goes deeper than we thought." "I know. We're headed to Riverside Care Center now to check on David Johnson." "In this storm, Alexander, it's not safe. The governor just upgraded to a state of emergency. They're closing the roads within the hour." Alexander glanced at Sophie, still sleeping. "We don't have a choice. If the power fails at that facility—" "I understand. Be careful." Rachel's voice softened. "How's Sophie?" "Exhausted, frightened, but stronger than she should have to be." He lowered his voice. "Rachel, when this is over, I want to apply for temporary guardianship of both children. Until David recovers, if he recovers." A brief silence. "That's a significant commitment, Alexander. The court will have questions about your suitability, your motives, your experience with children." "I have none," he admitted. "But I have resources to provide everything they need, and I'm learning that sometimes the most important qualification is simply caring enough to try." "I'll start the paperwork," Rachel promised. "But first get yourself and Sophie somewhere safe. This storm is turning into something historic." As if to emphasize her point, a violent gust rocked the car, sending it sliding sideways toward a snowbank before the driver managed to correct. "We're almost there," Alexander said both to Rachel and to himself. "I'll call you when we reach Riverside." The care facility emerged from the whiteout conditions like a ghost ship, a 3-story brick building with windows glowing warmly against the storm. The parking lot was nearly empty, most visitors having fled before the worst of the blizzard hit. Alexander's driver pulled as close to the entrance as possible. "Wait here," Alexander instructed him. "Keep the engine running." Sophie stirred as he gently unwrapped her from his coat. "Where are we?" she mumbled, eyes heavy with sleep. "Somewhere important," he told her softly. "Can you come with me? It won't take long, and then we'll go somewhere warm and safe." The child nodded, slipping her small hand into his as they braced themselves against the howling wind and made their way to the entrance. Inside the lobby was eerily quiet, the usual bustle of visitors and staff reduced to a skeleton crew riding out the storm. At the reception desk, a harried-looking nurse glanced up in surprise. "Sir, we're not accepting visitors during the state of emergency. You really shouldn't be out in this weather." Alexander approached, keeping Sophie close beside him. "I'm here about David Johnson. I understand he's a patient in your long-term care unit." The nurse frowned. "Mr. Johnson, I can't provide any information about patients to non-family members." Sophie stepped forward, her voice small but determined. "He's my daddy. Please, I need to see him." The nurse's expression softened as she looked at the child. "You're Sophie. Your father has your picture by his bedside." She hesitated, glancing between them. "But I don't understand. His chart says no visitors except for authorized medical personnel and his sister-in-law." "Caroline Evans," Alexander supplied. "She's currently in police custody for child abuse and neglect of Sophie and her brother. I have temporary emergency custody." He produced the court order Rachel had forwarded to his phone. The nurse studied it, then looked up sharply as the lights flickered. We're on generator backup, but with this storm, she made a decision. Follow me, quickly. They followed her through quiet corridors where emergency lights cast eerie shadows. The facility had the distinctive antiseptic smell of all medical institutions, but beneath it lay something more melancholy, the scent of lives suspended of time, passing unmarked and unmourned. His condition has been stable, the nurse explained as they walked. Minimal brain activity but consistent, breathing mostly on his own with supplemental oxygen. She glanced at Sophie. He might not respond, sweetheart, but some people believe patients in his condition can still hear familiar voices. They reached a door marked 307. The nurse paused her hand on the handle. There's something else you should know. For the past month, his medication levels have seemed off, higher than prescribed. When I questioned it, Dr. Winters said it was authorized by the family guardian. Sedating him, Alexander realized, keeping him from waking up. The nurse nodded grimly. That was my concern as well. I've been reducing the doses whenever I'm on shift, documenting everything. But Dr. Winters threatened to report me for interfering with treatment protocols. Where is Dr. Winters now? Called in sick when the storm warnings began. Her expression suggested what she thought of that decision. Most of our staff couldn't make it in. We're at minimum coverage tonight. She opened the door, revealing a standard hospital room bathed in the blue glow of monitoring equipment. In the bed lay a man in his mid-30s, thin and pale from months of immobility, his once strong features now hollowed by illness. Dark hair similar to Sophie's splayed against the white pillow. Various tubes connected him to machines that beeped steadily in the quiet room. Sophie froze in the doorway, her hand tightening in Alexander's. Daddy, she whispered. The nurse stepped back. I'll give you a few minutes. Press the call button if you need anything. As she turned to leave, she added quietly to Alexander, the generator should hold, but if power becomes an issue, this floor gets priority, still in this storm. After she'd gone, Sophie approached the bed cautiously as if afraid her father might disappear if she moved too quickly. Alexander stayed back, giving her space for this moment he couldn't begin to imagine. Daddy, it's me, Sophie. Her voice trembled as she reached the bedside, carefully placing her small hand over her father's larger one. I found Ethan, his medicine like I promised. He's getting better at the hospital. Tears filled her eyes. I'm sorry we couldn't visit before. Aunt Caroline wouldn't let us. She said you wouldn't wake up anyway, but I knew that wasn't true. Alexander felt his throat tighten as he watched this brave child speak to her unconscious father with such faith, such determination. She truly believed he could hear her, that somewhere inside that still body David Johnson was fighting to return to his children. Mr. Alexander found us, Sophie continued. He's helping us. He's not mad I took money from his wallet. He's really nice, Daddy. I think you'd like him. A slight movement caught Alexander's eye, David's index finger twitching against the bedsheet as Sophie held his hand. So subtle it might have been nothing. A random nerve firing, an involuntary reflex, or something more. Sophie gasped, Daddy, did you hear me? She leaned closer, her face alight with hope. Squeeze my hand if you can hear me. Please, Daddy. Alexander moved to the bedside, watching intently. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, David's fingers curled, applying the faintest pressure to Sophie's small hand. He heard me, Sophie cried, tears streaming down her face now. Daddy, wake up, please wake up. Alexander checked the monitors, noting increased brain activity. This wasn't his imagination or wishful thinking. Something was happening. Sophie, keep talking to him, he encouraged. I'm going to find the nurse. He stepped into the hallway looking for help when his phone rang. Delgado again. Reed, where are you? Riverside Care Center. We made it. Listen, David Johnson is showing signs of consciousness. I need to find... You need to get out of there, Delgado cut in. Now, Vanessa Wilson knows you've discovered her connection to Johnson. She's been monitoring your movements through your company's security protocols. Alexander's blood ran cold. How do you know this? Because she just fired her entire security team except for 2 men. They left Pinnacle headquarters 20 minutes ago, heading for Riverside. In this storm, that means they're desperate or dangerous. Probably both. Alexander glanced back at the room where Sophie sat with her father, then down the empty hallway. The facility was running on minimal staff. If Vanessa's men arrived, I've alerted local police, Delgado continued, but response times are compromised by the storm. You need to move Johnson if possible or at minimum secure that room. Understood. Alexander's mind raced, calculating options. Contact Boston General. Tell them we need an emergency medical transport for a coma patient showing signs of waking. I don't care what it costs or what strings need pulling. On it. And Reed, be careful. Anyone willing to drive through this blizzard isn't stopping for a polite conversation. Alexander returned to room 307, forcing his expression to remain calm as Sophie looked up hopefully. The nurse is coming, he told her, moving to check the hallway again. Sophie, did your father ever talk about his work, what he was inventing before the accident? Sophie nodded. His special computer chips. He said they would help people talk to computers like they were real people, like magic but with science. Artificial intelligence processors. Of course, David Johnson had been developing next-generation hardware for AI applications technology that could be worth billions to the first company that controlled it. Technology that Vanessa had apparently been willing to commit multiple crimes to acquire. The lights flickered again longer this time. Outside, the storm howled with increasing fury, rattling the windows in their frames. Alexander made a decision. Sophie, we need to move your father somewhere safer. This storm might affect the power, and that could be dangerous for his machines. Before Sophie could respond, footsteps sounded in the hallway. Heavy, purposeful steps that didn't match the quiet efficiency of medical staff. Alexander moved quickly, shutting the door and engaging the lock. What's wrong? Sophie asked, eyes widening with renewed fear. Nothing to worry about, Alexander assured her, though his own pulse had quickened. Just being cautious. Why don't you keep talking to your father while I make a call? As Sophie resumed her quiet conversation, Alexander stepped into the small adjoining bathroom, phone in hand. He called Rachel. Vanessa's sent people to Riverside, he said without preamble. We're locked in Johnson's room, but we need assistance. Is there any update on emergency transport? Boston General has dispatched a team, but in these conditions. Rachel's voice was tense. Alexander, if Vanessa is making this move now, she must be desperate. The police found documents in Caroline's apartment, legal papers transferring guardianship of the children to a corporate entity controlled by Martin Green. She was never meant to keep them, Alexander realized. She was just a temporary solution until they could legally gain control of the children and through them access to Johnson's patents. His disgust was palpable. Using children as pawns to steal intellectual property, and my company was involved. Not you, Rachel corrected firmly. You're fixing this. A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Alexander ended the call, moving back into the room as Sophie looked up in alarm. Mr. Johnson, it's Dr. Winters, a man's voice smooth and professional. I received an alert about increased neural activity. I need to examine the patient immediately. Alexander motioned for Sophie to remain silent, approaching the door but not opening it. Dr. Winters, the nurse mentioned you had called in sick due to the storm. A brief pause. The emergency brought me in. Please open the door. Could you have the duty nurse come as well? She was just checking his vitals. Another pause, longer this time. The nurse is attending another patient. Sir, I must insist you open this door. Hospital protocol requires. I don't think so, Alexander interrupted. Sophie, stay with your father. He heard muttered conversation outside, then a more aggressive knock. Security, open the door now. Alexander surveyed the room quickly, looking for anything that could serve as a barrier or weapon if needed. The medical equipment was mounted on wheeled stands. He began moving them in front of the door, creating an obstacle course that would slow anyone entering. Sophie watched with wide eyes, instinctively understanding the danger, even if she didn't comprehend its source. Are the bad people trying to hurt Daddy again? They won't get the chance. Alexander promised, his jaw set with determination. He checked his phone, no signal now. The storm must have affected the cell towers. They were on their own. Outside, the voices grew more insistent, threats thinly veiled beneath professional concern. Then a new sound, the jingle of keys. Someone with access was helping them. Alexander looked around desperately for options. The window was too small and they were 3 stories up. The bathroom offered no escape route. They were trapped. A groan from the bed drew their attention. David Johnson's eyelids fluttered, his head moving slightly on the pillow. He was fighting his way back to consciousness, unaware of the danger just outside his door. Sophie rushed to his side. "Daddy, can you hear me? Please wake up." The lock turned with an ominous click. Alexander positioned himself between the door and the bed, prepared to defend this family he'd only just met, but felt inexplicably responsible for. The door pushed open, scraping against the medical equipment Alexander had positioned as barriers. A man's face appeared in the gap, not medical staff, but security, his expression grim and determined. "Mr. Reed," he said coldly, "you need to step aside. This doesn't concern you." "Everything about this concerns me," Alexander replied, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "David Johnson and his children are under my protection now." The security guard's laugh held no humor. "Protection from what we're here to ensure the patient's care continues appropriately." "You mean continues to keep him sedated while Vanessa Wilson steals his life's work?" Alexander challenged. "It's over. The police know everything about Caroline Evans, about the guardianship arrangement, about the attempted theft of Johnson's patents." Something flickered in the man's eyes, uncertainty perhaps. He glanced behind him as if seeking direction. "You have a choice," Alexander continued, sensing weakness. "Walk away now before you're implicated in attempted murder, child abuse, and corporate espionage. Or come through that door and add assault to the charges you'll face." The moment stretched tension, building like the storm outside. Then unexpectedly, the power failed completely. The room plunged into darkness, emergency lights casting everything in an eerie red glow seconds later. The monitoring equipment switched to backup battery power alarms, beeping urgently as systems reset. In that moment of confusion, the door burst open, equipment clattering to the floor as two men forced their way in. Sophie screamed, clinging to her father's bed. Alexander braced himself, outnumbered, but refusing to yield. The first guard lunged forward, reaching for Alexander's arm. Years of corporate warfare had taught Alexander to recognize threats, but physical confrontation was outside his experience. Still, desperation and adrenaline proved powerful teachers. He sidestepped, using the man's momentum to send him stumbling into medical equipment. The second man was more cautious, circling around to approach David Johnson's bed. "Nothing personal," he said, reaching for the IV line. "Just following orders." Alexander launched himself across the room, tackling the man before he could reach the IV. They crashed into the wall, grappling for control. Alexander was heavier but less experienced in physical combat. The guard landed a solid punch to his ribs, driving the air from his lungs. Sophie's terrified voice cut through the chaos. "Stop! Please stop!" The distraction cost Alexander, allowing the guard to shove him backward. He stumbled, fell hard against the edge of a metal cart. Pain lanced through his shoulder, but he pushed himself upright, refusing to stay down. The first guard had regained his footing, producing what looked like a syringe from his pocket. "Hold him still," he instructed his partner. "This ends now." Alexander tensed, preparing for another charge when a new voice entered the fray, weak but unmistakably alert. "Get away from my daughter." All eyes turned to the bed where David Johnson had raised himself on one elbow, his face pale but his eyes burning with paternal fury. Years of technological expertise had left his body weakened, but the months of reduced sedation had allowed his consciousness to fight its way back. The sight of his daughter in danger had provided the final push he needed. The guards hesitated, clearly unprepared for an awake and angry David Johnson. In that moment of uncertainty, the room's door burst open again, this time revealing the nurse from earlier, accompanied by two police officers struggling to catch their breath after climbing stairs in the power outage. "Police hands where we can see them." What followed was a blur of activity guards, subdued and handcuffed statements, taken medical personnel rushing to stabilize David Johnson properly. Through it all, Sophie remained by her father's side, her small hand clutched in his, as if afraid he might slip away again if she let go. Alexander sat on a plastic chair in the corner, allowing a paramedic to examine his injured shoulder. It was likely just bruised, but the adrenaline crash left him feeling every one of his 54 years. His phone buzzed with a restored signal. "Rachel." "Alexander, thank God. The police radio reported they reached you just in time." "We're okay," he assured her, watching Sophie lean against her father's bed, exhaustion finally overtaking fear. "David Johnson is awake, weak but conscious. How's Ethan, boy?" "Improving hourly. The proper medication is already making a difference." She paused. "There's more news. Vanessa Wilson attempted to access Pinnacle's secure servers, presumably to delete evidence. The security team you'd installed last year caught her in the act. She's been arrested along with Martin Green. Alexander felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. Vanessa had been with him for 7 years. He trusted her completely, never questioning her loyalty. That blindness had nearly cost these children everything. The storm's beginning to abate, Rachel continued. Boston General is sending transport for both David and Sophie as soon as roads are passable. They should be reunited with Ethan by morning. Good, Alexander said simply, too tired for more elaborate responses. And Alexander, the emergency guardianship petition has been filed. Judge Hoffman wants to speak with you tomorrow, but given the circumstances, I believe she'll be favorable. After ending the call, Alexander watched as a doctor examined David Johnson, speaking quietly with him while checking vitals and responses. Sophie had finally succumbed to sleep curled in a chair pulled close to her father's bed, her small face peaceful for the first time since Alexander had met her. One of the police officers approached, notebook in hand. Mr. Reed, we need your statement about what happened here and your connection to the Johnson family. Alexander considered the question, looking at Sophie, thinking of Ethan in his hospital bed across town. My connection to the Johnson family. 24 hours ago, he'd been a billionaire tech CEO whose only connection to these children was $100 in a handwritten note. Now he felt responsible for them in a way he couldn't fully articulate. They needed help, he said simply. I was in a position to provide it. The officer nodded, seemingly satisfied with this explanation. Well, sir, you likely saved 3 lives tonight. Not bad for someone who normally saves companies instead of people. Alexander hadn't thought of it that way, but the officer was right. For decades, he'd measured success by stock prices, market share, and technological innovation. Never by the simple metric of whether he had made another human being's life better or worse. Sophie stirred in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible before settling again. Looking at her, Alexander felt a certainty he hadn't experienced in years. Whatever came next, whether temporary guardianship supporting David Johnson's recovery or simply ensuring the children's future security, he would see it through. 1 year later, Alexander Reed stood in a different hospital room, this one filled with sunlight in the cheerful chaos of balloons and gift bags. Ethan Johnson, now 6, bounced on his toes beside the bed, where his father sat in regular clothes, ready for discharge after his final follow-up surgery. Easy, buddy, David laughed, ruffling his son's hair. I'm still a bit sore. But you're all fixed now, right? Ethan persisted, his face once pale and drawn, now healthy and vibrant. No more hospital after today. That's right, David confirmed. Just regular checkups for both of us. Speaking of which, how's that heart of yours feeling today? Ethan puffed out his chest proudly. Strong Dr. Sarah says I'm the best patient she's ever had. He is remarkably compliant with his medication regimen, Alexander added from the doorway. Unlike his father, who I caught skipping physical therapy last week. David had the grace to look sheepish. Guilty as charged. But in my defense, I was finalizing the prototype designs. Which reminds me, he reached for a folder on the bedside table, extending it to Alexander. The final patent's ready for submission. Pinnacle Technologies gets first licensing rights as agreed. Alexander accepted the folder with a nod of thanks. The past year had transformed both men. David had regained his health in his role as father while continuing his groundbreaking work in AI processor architecture. Alexander had stepped back from daily operations at Pinnacle, focusing instead on steering the company back to its original mission of technology that served humanity rather than exploited it. The door burst open as Sophie raced in, now 8 years old and flourishing. They're here, Grandpa Patrick brought the celebration cake from the bakery. Behind her came Patrick Sullivan carrying a large bakery box. The former baker had become an unexpected fixture in their unconventional family. His kind wisdom, a stabilizing presence for both children during their father's recovery. Not just any cake, Patrick announced, setting the box on the rolling table. A special Freedom Day sourdough cinnamon roll cake, David's favorite. The past 12 months had forged bonds none of them could have anticipated. After David's awakening, his recovery had been challenging: physical therapy to rebuild atrophied muscles, cognitive therapy to address lingering effects of the medically induced coma, emotional healing for the entire family. Alexander had provided a temporary home for all 3 Johnsons during the initial months, his penthouse transforming from a sterile showcase into a place of laughter, mess, and genuine living. The emergency guardianship had eventually transitioned to a more informal arrangement as David regained his strength. The legal battles had been extensive. Vanessa and Martin Green faced multiple felony charges. Carolyn Evans had been sentenced to 5 years for child endangerment and drug distribution, and Pinnacle Technologies had undergone a painful but necessary corporate cleansing. Through it all, the unlikely connection between a billionaire tech CEO and a struggling family had deepened into something none of them had expected: friendship. Perhaps even more, a chosen family. "Before we demolish this masterpiece," David said, gesturing to the cake, "I'd like to say something." He looked around at the gathered faces, his children, Alexander, Patrick, Rachel, Stevens, who had just arrived. "A year ago, I was lost in darkness, kept there by people who valued profit over human life. My children were suffering alone and afraid." Ethan slipped his small hand into his father's. Sophie leaned against Alexander, who had become a steady presence in their lives. Then a series of seemingly random events occurred: a lost wallet, a desperate child, a man who could have simply replaced what was taken but chose instead to find the person who took it. David's voice thickened with emotion. "Some might call it coincidence. I call it providence." Alexander felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with his long-healed, bruised ribs. A year ago, he had been as lost as David, though in a different kind of darkness: the isolation of success without meaning, wealth without purpose. "Sophie," David continued, turning to his daughter, "do you still have it?" The girl nodded, reaching into her pocket and withdrawing a familiar piece of paper, now carefully preserved in a small frame. Her original note, the one she'd left in Alexander's wallet. "I promise to work and pay you back every penny," David read aloud from the note. "Sophie, I think it's time to fulfill that promise." Sophie looked up at Alexander, her dark eyes serious. "I saved all my allowance for a whole year. It's $100 now." She held out a small envelope. "To pay you back." Alexander knelt to her level the same way he had that night beneath the bridge when a frightened child had first trusted him. "Sophie, your promise was already fulfilled long ago." "But I took your money," she insisted, $100, "and gave me something far more valuable in return." Alexander accepted the envelope, then pulled out his wallet. From it, he extracted a check, which he handed to David. "This is for the Children's Education Trust. $1 million. David's eyes widened. "Alexander, that's too much. We've discussed this." "It's not charity," Alexander interrupted firmly. "It's repayment." "For what?" David asked, bewildered. Alexander gazed at Sophie, then Ethan, then back to their father. "For teaching me what real wealth looks like." He turned back to Sophie, returning her envelope. "Your debt is paid in full, Sophie Johnson, and then some." Later that evening, as sunset painted the Boston skyline in hues of gold and crimson, Alexander stood on his penthouse balcony, watching the city transition from day to night. Behind him, the sounds of the impromptu celebration continued. Ethan's laughter, Sophie's excited chatter, David discussing his latest technological breakthrough with Rachel. Alexander's phone buzzed with a message from Delgado. "Vanessa Wilson's sentencing tomorrow at 9 a.m. Still want to attend?" He typed a brief reply, "No, moving forward, not back." The door to the balcony slid open, and David joined him, 2 glasses of scotch in hand. He offered one to Alexander, who accepted with a nod of thanks. "Penny for your thoughts?" David asked, leaning against the railing. Alexander considered the question, watching the city lights emerge like stars against the darkening landscape. "I was just thinking about value, about how we measure worth." David nodded, understanding. "Before the accident, I was obsessed with my work. The patents, the technology, the potential impact. I thought that was where value lived." He sipped his drink. "6 months in darkness taught me otherwise." "For me, it was a handwritten note from a 7-year-old, Alexander admitted. 3 sentences that made me question every measure of success I'd used for decades." Inside, Sophie had started teaching Patrick a hand-clapping game, their rhythmic pattering punctuated by Ethan's attempts to join in. The sounds of simple joy floated out to the balcony. "They want you to come to parents' night at school next week," David said casually. "Both of us?" Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Both. Sophie says since you helped save their dad and their dad saved them, and they kinda saved you from being a lonely billionaire, her words not mine, that makes us all family." David smiled. Hard to argue with that logic. Family. The word resonated in Alexander's chest, filling spaces he hadn't realized were empty. Not traditional family, perhaps, but something equally valid: a connection forged through crisis, strengthened by choice rather than obligation. "I'd be honored," he said simply. They stood in comfortable silence, watching night claim the city completely. Below them, millions of lives unfolded in patterns too complex to comprehend, strangers passing each other daily, unaware of how a single moment of connection might alter everything. "You know," David said thoughtfully, "there's an old saying about how when you save a life, you become responsible for it forever." Alexander considered this. "I don't think I saved your lives. If anything, you saved mine." David shook his head. "Maybe it's not about who saved whom. Maybe it's about recognizing when we're both drowning and deciding to reach for each other instead of sinking alone." From inside came Sophie's voice calling them back to the celebration. David pushed away from the railing, clapping Alexander on the shoulder before heading back inside. Alexander lingered a moment longer, contemplating how different his life had become in a single year. The corporate titan who had once defined himself by acquisitions and market share now measured his days by a child's laughter, a friend's recovery, a purpose rediscovered. He reached into his pocket, touching the edge of a small photograph he now carried everywhere, Sophie and Ethan, grinning broadly on either side of their father, at the hospital the day David had first been able to stand unassisted. Alexander was in the background, watching with what Rachel had later described as the look of a man who's found something he didn't know he was searching for. That was the true story he realized now. Not a billionaire saving two homeless children, but three lives intersecting at their most vulnerable points, each becoming stronger through the connection. Sophie appeared at the door, her expression impatient. "Alexander, you're missing the best part." "Coming," he promised, taking one last look at the city below, a world of strangers passing in the night, each carrying the potential to change another's life with the simplest act of kindness or courage. All it took was noticing. All it took was caring enough to try on. Alexander Reed turned from the view and walked inside toward the light and noise and messy joy of the family that had found him when he didn't know he was lost. Behind him, the night continued, full of wallets, waiting to be lost, notes, waiting to be written lives, waiting to intersect in ways that would transform them all.